The corporation's essay from February of 1997 is a useful examination question for us to have a look at. I think this is a fairly easy and straightforward question, but that doesn't mean that the question doesn't have its intimidation factor. It's a long question, with a fairly long call of the question. And as you know, I think that will make it an easier question to tackle than one of those very short, cryptic fact patterns. Take a look with me at the call of the question. What are Alice's rights and remedies, if any, with regard to 1 through 4 above? Discuss. Well, we know we've got one plaintiff, and we know that she's got to have theories of liability against somebody and prayers for relief. We glance above at the previous paragraph, and we get the real call of the question. Alice wishes, 1, to compel Graphic to make available for her inspection the shareholders' lists and all contracts signed in the last 3 months. Well, let's stop right there for a minute. A shareholder does have a right to inspect shareholders' lists. That much we know for sure. As far as her right to inspect contracts, she is likely to need to make something of a factual showing, but it's possible, in fact, maybe even likely, that a shareholder should have the right to examine at least some of the contracts. 2, to recover her loss on her recent stock purchase. All right, here she is seeking a damages remedy, and it looks as if she is seeking it for herself as opposed to derivatively for the company. 3, to force Frank to disgorge the profits on his stock sale. Here it looks as if Alice is acting derivatively, seeking to prevent the corporation from being harmed, as opposed to recovering money that she claims to have lost personally. And then, finally, 4, to have the PAPECO contract declared invalid. So, if a shareholder is seeking to get rid of a PAPECO contract, it would have to be an ultra-virus contract. We move on to consider the fact pattern itself. Go to the top of the question. Graphic is a California corporation that sells office copying equipment. And we see up front that the Articles of Incorporation prohibit Graphic's sale of paper products. And we know from call of the question number 4 that we've got an aggrieved shareholder who is seeking to have a contract set aside. And if we've got a corporation that has a prohibition against certain conduct, then that conduct will be deemed ultra-virus. At the end of this first paragraph, we meet Frank, the person mentioned in the third call of the question, and he has signed a contract to buy a paper mill. All right? And it looks as if he is planning to reveal this contract in the following week. It looks as if that's an ultra-virus act. Let's read on. In paragraph 2, we meet Alice. She is a 9.2% shareholder of Graphic. She writes Frank. She wants to look at the shareholder list and the contracts. Frank directs the corporate secretary to deny her request. All right, a flat denial. Now, we already know about one contract that is dubious, this contract for the purchase of PAPECO. Are there others? Perhaps yes. It certainly doesn't seem that this shareholder wants to go on some unreasonable fishing expedition. We move on to paragraph 3. Here the accountants of the corporation advise Frank that Graphic is about to show a $5 million loss for its current fiscal year. It's the only time it's lost money in its 20-year history. Frank does what many loss-fearing corporate insiders do. He sells 100,000 shares of stock for a $25 price, and it includes 22,000 shares that he purchased 2 months ago by exercising a stock option, and so we've got several different stock prices. All of this is relevant when it comes down to calculating damages. We move on to paragraph 4. Here we've got a press conference called by Frank. He indicates that there has been a major contract signed, and Alice goes out and buys stock at 28 per share after hearing the news, hence her second claim in her prayers for relief. Next, the news of the fiscal year loss becomes public. The shares drop in value by $8 down to $20 per share. Now we get Alice's wish list, and then finally the call of the question. We are asked to discuss these issues. It's fair enough. There are plenty of issues. We're dealing with a timed exam, so our job now is to turn all of this into something manageable so that we can write a coherent, literate, thorough, fact-specific answer under time constraints. Fortunately, a clear-headed approach to corporations and a good background in remedies makes this quite possible. Have a look at the outline of issues that I've presented, and you'll see I pretty much follow the call of the question slavishly. In this instance, you'll see that I use a Roman numeral for each of the 4 items that we're directed to consider. With regard to the shareholder lists and the contracts, you'll see that I have a separate heading for each of these 2 requests, but internally, there's not a whole lot to do organizationally. It's a pretty straightforward, simple, direct question. We will give it a simple, direct answer. Next, we move on to Alice's efforts to recover the loss in her own stock purchase. Here we're dealing with 10b-5. And the reason for that is because the executive is accused of making a misleading statement that caused her to trade. So we examine the plaintiff, the shareholder, the defendant, and then we consider the elements of 10b-5: materiality, reliance, scienter, and interstate commerce. Do you see how easy it is to organize these questions when we have some understanding of how the material is being tested? Finally, we reach a conclusion. Next, we turn to consider Frank's stock sale profits. Here the examiners are testing our knowledge of Rule 16b, and even though this is a fairly interesting and scholarly topic, on the bar examination, glib familiarity is all they're looking for. So we focus on the plaintiff and the defendant again. We narrowly and specifically consider the short swing profit, and then we conclude. In this case, we conclude that Frank has to disgorge his profits, not to Alice, the plaintiff, but to the corporation itself. Then, finally, we turn to the PAPECO contract. Here, Alice is suing derivatively. She's alleging an ultra-virus action, and she can prove it. And the result will be remedies. The contract will be rescinded, and any damages that are caused are going to be the personal responsibility of Frank, because he is clearly the bad guy in this question. He's violated his fiduciary duty to the company and to the shareholders, and if there are any damages to be paid, he's going to pay them. Okay, that's how we organize the answer. Now let's take a look at the answer that I present, and I'll offer a few additional ideas. Take a look at the very first paragraph. As usual, I lead with the facts. I explain who Alice is and what her demands are, and I identify Frank. Next, we turn to the 2-part analysis. First, we consider the shareholder lists, and here, this is something that she clearly is entitled to. With regard to the contracts, I indicate that it's likely she doesn't get to look at all of them, but as you look at my analysis, I think you'll see that it is pretty reasonable on its face, and as sophisticated as it reasonably would need to be in order to answer this section of the call of the question. I think this first part is not that hard. So now we move on to the recovery of the stock losses that Alice is seeking through Rule 10b-5. Look again at how I lead with the facts. I present one short paragraph explaining the factual context that this part of Alice's dispute arises from. Then I focus on the elements, and I do so in considerable depth. You'll notice I don't spend a lot of time reciting the law, but the entire structure of this part of my answer is based on elements of the law. No one reasonably can look at this answer and argue that its author is ignorant of the law. Remember, there's a limited amount of time. You can't do everything. Perfect definitions and model analysis won't fit in the same timed answer. So I say, strip the definitions to the bone, leave them out altogether if you have to, and devote your attention to analysis. So, as we consider this section of analysis, I think you'll agree, again, it covers the bases. It's complete with regard to the law, and it is both meticulous and comprehensive with regard to analyzing the facts. I argue that your job on the bar exam essays is to find a home for the facts. If there are facts that go homeless on your answer, there are points that will be taken off your score. So, ultimately we conclude that Alice is going to be able to recover her $8 loss on each of her 5,000 shares for a total of $40,000 in damages. Look, the examiners give us problems that almost always involve round numbers. Do the arithmetic. It's not that difficult, and it allows you to show the examiners that you're not hopelessly afraid and unable to think clearly on the exam. Now, if you happen to be so math-phobic that you can't even expect yourself to accurately do a simple arithmetic problem, fair enough. Just set up the equation and make that clear, and then let the grader calculate. This isn't a math test after all, it's the bar exam. The bottom line, literally in this case, is do the math if you can. If it's really a problem, set up the formula and then move on. So, next we turn to Frank's stock sale profit. Here, again, you'll see up front, I lead with the facts. I do it in 3 short sentences. I'm not advocating that you merely copy the fact pattern. What I am advocating is that you find a home for the facts and make your answer into a readable story so that a disinterested grader can follow your thinking and see that you know what you're talking about. So, once we set up the 16b issue, you'll see all I do is connect the facts to the elements. The bottom line is Frank has to disgorge his short swing profits. Finally, we turn to the PAPECO contract and Alice's derivative action. You'll see up front, I focus on the procedural status of the case, why Alice has standing, what she's doing, and I even indicate that she might have to make a demand on the board of directors. Here it looks futile. So then we focus on the ultra-virus nature of this agreement, comparing it to the Articles of Incorporation, and then notice how I touch on remedies, and I even call it a remedies section. The bottom line is Alice ought to be able to void this contract, and that means rescission. And since Frank signed this ultra-virus agreement, he's going to be personally liable for any damages.